Hey everyone, welcome to our Let's Measure series. This is Let's Measure number 2. Today we'll be looking at football, so it's Let's Measure football. And just for those of you that don't know, our Let's Measure series is going to be taking a look at a number of different activities, and we'll be analyzing some data and certain little tidbits from the data, hopefully to provide you with more insight and a bit of value there. So, as I mentioned, we've looked at football. Dan has collected some IMeasureU step as well as GPS data with some socially distanced training at his football club. So, Dan, dive into it. What have you done?
Yeah, so first week back to training last week. So it gave me a great opportunity to get the IMeasureU sensors on and also my GPS unit on. So I'm going to take you through the data in the dashboard today, and we're going to pay particular attention to the utilization of the footnotes feature within IMeasureU Step, and also just to kind of touch upon the importance of having a piece of hardware that's able to quantify the mechanical loads precisely. Okay, so I'll go ahead and share my screen. So most of you will know that you access your IMeasureU Step dashboard via our website, but for those of you who don't, that's how you do it. So I'll go ahead and log in. So I wasn't able to record this session with a video camera, so we're just going to dive straight into the data. So I'm going to open up my profile. And the session that we're interested in today is the one from the 2nd of July. So I'm going to click on that. So just to quickly run over what we can see here. Obviously, you have the session card illuminated at the top, which gives you the summary statistics. As we move down the page, we've got a session breakdown in these first two graphs and your summary statistics on the right-hand side. You can see the footnotes there, which I'll touch upon in just a moment. Your asymmetry tree is the next graph. So that gives you insight into the distribution of those impacts across the peak resulting continuum and any kind of initial insight into any asymmetries. And then, of course, you have your longitudinal view. So your longitudinal session tracking graph, and also your asymmetry heat map. So what we're going to do first is just have a look at these first couple of graphs, and you can see there's quite a few interesting things actually we can pull out from these graphs before we dive into anything in more detail. So what you've got on the top graph is the accumulation of impact load running across the screen there from left to right, so from low in the bottom left corner to high in the top right. But you can see straight away that there is a difference between left and right that starts around about 7:55, minute 7:55, and it gradually opens up all the way to the end of the session. And just running over the top of that, you can see that the impact load per minute values are much higher in this first 10-15 minutes of the session, and much more equal. And then as we move into the main component of the session, the impact load per minute values are a little bit lower, and there's also a fair difference between left and right, as you can see there in the different colors, left being blue and right being orange. So these are summarized on the right hand side. You can see the impact loads for left and right being 39.7 and 48.6. And off the bat, if you were just having a look at the session summary statistics there, you'd think, well, this guy's favoring his right leg quite significantly. A lot more mechanical load is going through the right leg. However, by utilizing footnotes, we can see that that's not the case for the whole session. So as I referred to a little bit earlier, the first 15 minutes are fairly equal, and in some of the, well, when we dive in a moment, we'll probably see that there's actually a slight dominance for the left-hand side. So the way we dive into that is utilizing footnotes, which are simply little descriptions of the activities that will be conducted at that point in time. Now, for me, collecting data on myself, I wasn't able to add these in real time. I've added them retrospectively. But for a coach working with an athlete on a one-to-one basis, or simply observing from the side, these can be added in real time. So they can be real precise in the sense of making sure that the footnotes are started and stopped as and when those specific drills or components are being utilized. So by clicking on the individual footnotes, they zoom into that specific area of the session. Now, as I've clicked on the warm-up there, you can see the summary statistics have changed on the right-hand side. And there is, in fact, a slight asymmetry in favouring of the left-hand side, which is obviously against the asymmetry of the complete session. And just to provide the guys watching with a little bit of context, obviously this first component was the warm-up. So that consisted of some pulse raising activities, running, skipping, side steps, and then also some dynamic movements, so some squats, some lunges, both in the sagittal plane and the frontal plane. And the second component of this session was some conditioning work, so set 1, rep 1, all the way through to set 1, rep 3. They were simply linear runs with change of directions at the end. So I'm going to expand the footnotes to cover all of that component. So you can see that that's roughly 14 minutes there. And in fact, for this component of the session, or this part of the session, there was a slight dominance of the left-hand side. So this is the pure running component of this session. So you can see throughout this part, I'm pretty symmetrical. Not much going on there to worry about. However, if we look at footnote number 5, the mixed drill session, which again is a lot more multi-directional. It's a little bit lower in intensity with respect to impact load per minute, and there is some ball work involved here. That completely changes. So for whatever reason, whether that's a slight preference of pushing off on my right leg, which is my stronger leg, or just simply the fact that a lot of my movements within these drills were towards the right hand side, you can see that completely changes the outlook for this session. A lot of the total asymmetry has resulted from that back end there. Is there any questions or any points you want to raise so far, James?
No, I think that's all good. I think it's great to note already how, you take a look at the whole session and you think you can make conclusions, but when you nail it down drill to drill, you see some big differences that can really, drive your practice.
Absolutely, and I think that becomes more apparent in the second graph. Okay, so our asymmetry, or third graph, I should say, our asymmetry tree. So just to recap on what this shows, along the x-axis, you have all of your step impacts. The left ones being blue and the right ones being orange. And then running up the y-axis, you've got your intensity bins, so your peak resultant impacts, all the way from 1G up to 200 plus Gs. So at the moment we're presenting the whole session, and you can see from the count view that there looks to be a bigger accumulation of steps on the right hand side of the higher intensities. We can be a little bit more specific by clicking on the difference view, and quite clearly here you can see that there is a dominance, or preference rather, of the right hand side of those higher intensities, which is ultimately contributing to the increased impact load on the right hand side. But again, utilizing footnotes, what we can do is we can jump into those individual components. So if we click on the warm up first, some really high intensity impacts there, even in the warm up. But if we click on the difference, we should see a relative preference for the left hand side there. There are a few more high intensity impacts on the left hand side. And if I start on set 1, rep 1, and open that up all the way through, just to cover the whole.
And Dan, you said there was a change of direction in these set 1s, set 1 to set 3, or set 1 to rep 1 to rep 3. Apologies. Yeah. And there was change of direction. Were they mixed? Can you remember, was there preference to left or right, or were they generally split?
I consciously try to alternate which foot I'm turning off of. However, I appreciate that's not always going to be possible within a training or match situation. So what you will find is athletes typically turn off their strongest foot as long as that fits in with their kind of gait cycle, and ultimately those deceleration steps, the change of direction steps, they are going to be associated with the highest intensity. So it's likely that a lot of those are up here at the higher intensity bins. Just off the bat, that looks pretty symmetrical. If we look at the difference quickly, again, throughout those individual components, there's not much difference. You can see from the scale of the x-axis on the bottom here, nothing really breaches maybe 10 steps either side per intensity bin. So that's pretty cool. And ultimately, what you can use these footnotes, as I've been able to identify the individual repetitions themselves, you can look at the individual repetitions specifically and see how those asymmetries change throughout. So you can see there's quite a lot of variance there as we move through. So whether I had trying to think back now to last Thursday, whether there was any kind of underlying stiffness I felt maybe in my left hand side, which took a little bit of time to warm up. I think this data would certainly suggest that as we go through those repetitions, my kind of running profile changes, which is obviously interesting in itself. But the footnotes enable you to kind of break those individual components down. And if we just go back up to the top quickly, so I don't mean to jump from side to side. If we just run through those individual impact load values there, so you can see I'm looking over here on the right hand side. So for the warm up, 5.2 versus 4.8, 3.2 versus 3.5, 3.9 versus 3.8, 3.7 versus 3.6. So there's definitely like for whatever reason, maybe in that first set, I was pushing off a lot harder on my right hand leg on those change of directions. That's probably what I would associate with that.
Yep.
Yeah, so given we're focusing on one session here, I don't particularly want to dive into the the longitudinal views. So we're gonna stick on these top two graphs. But again, the important thing that I want to kind of the point I want to get across here is where some of these impacts are landing with a sense to the intensity. So this is where the hardware really comes in, and it's important to have a piece of technology that's able to quantify those high intensity impacts. Now, obviously, we're collecting data as close to the source of interest as possible, but we can see here that pretty much, I mean, there's a lot of impacts that are occurring above the 25 to 27 G bin there, which is the typical top end of a peak resultant range that you'll get from a standard plus or minus 16 G accelerometer. Obviously, we're fortunate with IMeasureU Step that we have a plus or minus 200 G accelerometer, and I can actually kind of break that down for you in a little bit more detail. So if we just focus on the running component of this session first, and again, we can see impacts all the way up to, you know, some impacts right up to 100. There's one impact, in fact, at the 90 to 140 G bin, but there's a lot of impacts in the 40 to 65 G bin. Without the access to the high intensity accelerometer there, we would have misrepresented 435 impacts. So basically what would happen if you only had a low G accelerometer there is that you'd basically group them all in that top intensity bin. So 435 impacts occurred above that 25 to 27 intensity bin range. That's 28% of the total session impacts. So that's obviously a massive amount of the proportion of the session. And if we open that up to the whole session, that number of impacts increases to 779 impacts, which ultimately is a lower proportion of total session impacts. It's only 12%. But it's important, I think, to recognize that without the ability to monitor these these impacts of a high intensity accelerometer, we'd be misrepresenting a lot of the session, and not really truly understanding the intensity of the mechanical workload.
Absolutely. So, I mean, Dan, the first thing that comes to mind when discussing, the hardware and how much of the session may have been misrepresented, it shows what a difficult job sports scientists and strength and conditioning coaches have nowadays, where they essentially also need to have another feather in the cap of being a technologist, if you will. You've got to understand the technology and understand the pros and cons of what it actually is going to give to you. So, which makes it very tough. That's not what you really taught in university. And for those of you that are interested regarding the technologies, we do have our IMeasureU Academy, which details a bit of technology in the ecosystem at the moment, as well as a deep dive into obviously inertial measurement units for you to understand them. And there's pros and cons to all these technologies, and they're answering different questions, correct, Dan?
Absolutely, and I kind of second your thoughts there, James. Obviously, the majority of practitioners working in elite sport are time poor, and they're having to deal with data left, right, and centre. So finding the important stuff and using a platform that's enabled or able to do a lot of that work, the heavy lifting for you, is vital. It really is.
Absolutely. So that's a really interesting session. So Dan, from this, as a practitioner, if you put your practitioner boots on, what are you taking from this session?
Yeah, so the key takeaways from this session are that unless you have the ability or unless you're prepared to dive into the individual session components, just looking at the summary statistics can misrepresent what's actually going on. So by utilizing footnotes here, we could clearly see there was a difference in those running based drills to the mixed skill based drills, and that's hopefully what I've shown with the utilization of our footnotes feature. But secondly, the importance of having a piece of technology that's able to collect what you want it to collect. So without a high G accelerometer here, we would have misrepresented 28% of those impacts purely in those running drills. So we wouldn't have truly understood the intensity of those drills. And ultimately, when it comes to load monitoring, load management, profiling drills, grouping them into high, medium, and low intensity, it's important to be precise. And ultimately, for running-based sports, we obviously feel that you need to be measuring as close to the source as possible.
Brilliant. Dan, thank you for that. Really appreciate it. And guys, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. There will be more of these videos coming out. If you do want to follow our Let's Measure series, we do have a few other series coming out to keep an eye on. And please comment. We'd love to engage and see, what you guys would like to see. We'd love to analyze activities you guys are doing and would like to see differences in. So please don't be afraid to reach out, like and subscribe. And Dan, is there any final thoughts from you?
No, I think you've covered it, James. So yeah, head over to the IMeasureU Academy. Educate yourself and let us know if you have any questions or queries.
Brilliant, cool guys. We'll see you in a couple of weeks for our next Let's Measure one. We've got Let's Measure Cricket coming out in a couple of weeks, so keep an eye out for that, and we'll chat to you soon.